On December 15, 2006, Boston's elite gathered at the Rothschild mansion for what should have been a celebration of new life. Instead, they found 26-year-old Ruby Martinez, new bride of 73-year-old billionaire Jonathan Rothschild, dead in his private study. She was 3 months pregnant, but not with her husband's child. Some say it was the inheritance that killed her. Others blame forbidden love. But in the world of old money and deadly secrets, the truth is always worth dying for. 6 months earlier, June 2006. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the narrow windows of the Martinez family's Dorchester apartment when Ruby's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. She dressed carefully in the dark, choosing the cream silk blouse she'd spent 2 weeks' salary on. In the kitchen, her mother Maria was already preparing coffee, the arthritis in her hands making her movements slow and deliberate. "Mija," Maria said, watching Ruby apply her carefully practiced makeup. "This job at Rothschild. You're working too hard." Ruby kissed her mother's cheek, ignoring the concern in her voice. "Someone has to make sure you and Papa can retire someday." The truth was more complicated. Ruby had spent 6 months cultivating her position at Rothschild Industries, learning the rhythms of power and wealth that flowed through its corridors. She hadn't planned on falling in love with the boss's son. That had been an unexpected complication. 40 floors above the city, Jonathan Rothschild stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the summer rain pattern against the glass. At 73, he still cut an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came from 3 generations of old money and power. The Boston skyline spread out before him like an empire he'd spent his life expanding, yet today, it felt hollow. On his desk lay the papers that would reshape his legacy. Documents establishing the Rothschild Charitable Foundation, which would inherit half his personal fortune, nearly $4 billion. The other papers detailed the company restructuring that would leave his son, Christopher, with less control than he'd been raised to expect. "Mr. Rothschild." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your son is here for the meeting." Jonathan pressed the button without turning from the window. "Send him in." Christopher Rothschild, Chris to everyone except his father, strode into the office with the confidence of a man who'd never heard the word no at 35. He was the spitting image of his father in his prime. Sharp features, calculating eyes, and that distinctive Rothschild air of entitled determination. His Harvard business degree and junior partnership at the firm should have made his father proud. Instead, they'd become weapons in their endless war of wills. "Father," Chris nodded, taking his usual seat. "You wanted to discuss the charitable foundation." Jonathan finally turned from the window. "I'm making changes to my will." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Chris's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Half of my personal fortune will go to the foundation," Jonathan continued. "The other half will be split between you and the company trust." "Half?" Chris's carefully controlled voice cracked slightly. "That's billions in potential investment capital. Going to those who need it more than you do." Jonathan sat behind his massive mahogany desk. "You'll still inherit more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. This isn't about money." Chris stood, hands clenched. "This is about legacy. About what we could build." "What I've built," Jonathan corrected. "What you've yet to prove you can maintain." "Is this about the Singapore deal?" Chris's voice rose. "I told you, if we'd moved faster." "It's about every deal, Christopher. Every rash decision, every shortcut, every time you've chosen flash over substance." Jonathan picked up a folder from his desk. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the personal expenses you've been charging to the company? The apartment on Beacon Hill, the private flights, the restaurants." Chris's face flushed. "I represent this company. A certain lifestyle is expected." "By whom?" "The 20-something receptionist you've been seeing." The silence that followed was deafening. Chris felt his breath catch, but years of boardroom battles helped him maintain his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly. Jonathan sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "I'm not blind, son. I see how you look at her. Ruby Martinez, isn't it? Hired 6 months ago. 17 floors below, Ruby sat at the gleaming reception desk of Rothschild Industries, answering calls with the practiced charm that had landed her this coveted position. She watched Chris storm past her desk, their eyes meeting for just a fraction of a second. No one would have noticed the electricity in that glance, the secret heat of 6 months of hidden meetings, stolen kisses in emergency stairwells, and promises whispered in the dark of his downtown loft. Ruby's phone buzzed with a text, "My place. Tonight. Important." The rest of her day passed in a blur of calls, meetings, and carefully orchestrated moments. She'd learned to time her coffee breaks with Jonathan's schedule, to pause by the right artwork in the lobby, to let him glimpse her studying the company's history in quiet moments. Today, she'd worn her grandmother's pearl earrings, old-world elegance that set her apart from the other young employees. Later that evening, in Chris's minimalist Beacon Hill apartment, Ruby traced patterns on his bare chest as he told her about the will. Half to charity, he spat the word like poison. "While I'm supposed to be grateful for crumbs from the table." Ruby propped herself up on one elbow, dark hair spilling over her shoulders. "How much would the foundation get?" "About $4 billion. Chris laughed bitterly. Dear old Dad's attempt at redemption. Ruby's eyes widened. She thought of her parents' small apartment, her father still driving the same taxi after 20 years, her mother's arthritis from decades of cleaning houses. $4 billion. The number made her dizzy. "There might be a way," she said carefully, watching his face. "To keep it in the family." Chris sat up, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "Your father's lonely," Ruby said. "Everyone knows he hasn't dated since your mother died. And he's been noticing me." The plan unfurled between them like a poisonous flower. Chris's initial jealousy gave way to calculated interest as Ruby outlined how she could draw Jonathan's attention. A few carefully timed conversations, a shared interest in his art collection, the youthful energy he so clearly missed. He'd never suspect his own son's girlfriend, Ruby whispered. "And once I'm Mrs. Rothschild, the foundation becomes a family matter," Chris finished, pulling her close. "You're brilliant. You know that." But as Chris kissed her neck, Ruby caught their reflection in his bedroom window. For a moment, overlaid against the glittering Boston night, she barely recognized herself. She thought of her mother's words that morning, "You're working too hard," and wondered if Maria had sensed the change in her daughter, the growing shadow where her simple ambitions had once been. The next morning, Ruby arrived early at Rothschild Tower. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, elegant but approachable, a hint of perfume, those same pearl earrings lending an air of old-world class. As she arranged fresh flowers on her desk, she felt Jonathan's eyes on her from across the lobby. "Those are beautiful," he said, pausing at her desk. "Peonies." Ruby smiled, channeling the warmth that had won her this job in the first place. "My mother always said flowers make a space feel like home." "She sounds like a wise woman." Jonathan's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You know, I have quite a collection of botanical prints in my office. Perhaps you'd like to see them sometime." "I'd love to, Mr. Rothschild." As he walked away, Ruby pulled out her phone to text Chris. "It's starting." High above the city, storm clouds gathered over Boston's skyline. In 6 months, these same clouds would hang over the Rothschild mansion as police cars lined the curved driveway, their lights painting the rain in red and blue. But for now, there was only the quiet click of Ruby's heels on marble, the soft ding of elevator doors, and the first moves of a game that would end in tragedy. Neither of them could have known just how it would end. Success, Ruby had learned, was all about timing. Each morning, she arranged fresh flowers on her desk precisely at 8:45, knowing Jonathan Rothschild would pass through the lobby at 9 o'clock. She'd pause in her work, appearing absorbed in the delicate blooms, letting him glimpse the gentle smile that reminded him of softer, simpler times. "You have quite the eye for arrangements," he said one morning, his usual brisk pace slowing to a stop. "These remind me of my late wife's garden." Ruby looked up, practicing the perfect blend of surprise and warmth she'd rehearsed in her mirror. "Mrs. Rothschild was a gardener." "Margaret," he corrected softly. "Yes, she transformed our entire estate. You should see it sometime. The roses will be blooming soon." The invitation hung in the air like perfume, and Ruby thought back to the first time she'd caught Chris's attention at the company's New Year's party. She'd been standing in the corner of the grand ballroom, still new to her receptionist position, watching Boston's elite sweep past in designer gowns and generations-old jewelry. Chris had approached her with his bow tie slightly loosened, champagne in hand, radiating that current of rebellion beneath his polished exterior. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" he'd said, making her laugh with his commentary on the aristocratic circus around them. That night, he'd taken her up to his private office, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Boston's winter skyline. Their first kiss tasted of expensive champagne and dangerous possibilities. Now, months later, Ruby sat in Jonathan Rothschild's office, discussing the botanical prints he'd mentioned. She'd researched extensively, dropping carefully chosen observations about composition and historical context. "I never expected to find someone who shared my appreciation for these," Jonathan said, his eyes warming as he watched her examine a particularly rare piece. "Most people your age." "My mother always said I was born in the wrong era," Ruby smiled, the lie flowing smoothly. In truth, she'd spent nights memorizing art books from the public library, preparing for exactly this moment. Later that evening, in Chris's downtown apartment, she recounted the conversation while he paced restlessly. "His taking too long," Chris muttered, running a hand through his hair. "The foundation paperwork goes through next month." Ruby watched him from the leather couch, remembering their early days of secret lunches and stolen moments in his office. The passion was still there, but lately it felt edged with something harder, more desperate. "These things take time," she soothed. "Push too fast and he'll get suspicious." "Time?" Chris turned on her. "While he's planning to give away billions. While he's trying to prove I'm not worthy of my own birthright." Ruby stood, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Trust me. I know what I'm doing." But later that night, alone in her small bedroom in Dorchester, Ruby stared at her reflection and wondered if she did. Jonathan's kindness was unexpected, genuine in a way that made her rehearsed responses feel increasingly hollow. The next week brought a breakthrough. Jonathan invited her to lunch, ostensibly to discuss the company's art collection. The restaurant he chose was Old Boston, all dark wood and discreet waiters. Ruby wore her grandmother's pearls again, paired with a modest blue dress that suggested elegance rather than wealth. "You seem different from most young people in the office," Jonathan observed over wine neither of them touched. "More grounded." Ruby thought of her father's taxi shifts, her mother's cleaning jobs. "I learned early that nothing worthwhile comes easily." It was the first completely honest thing she'd said to him. The lunch became a weekly tradition. Ruby found herself sharing real stories about her family, her struggles, her dreams, carefully edited but truthfully told. Jonathan listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing his own memories of building the company, of his late wife, of his complicated relationship with Chris. "He's always been impatient," Jonathan confided one afternoon. "Wanting to run before he could walk." Ruby felt the weight of hidden knowledge press against her chest. That same morning, she'd left Chris's bed, where they'd refined their plans between passionate embraces. The double life was wearing on her, but the stakes were too high to falter now. Jonathan began including her in corporate events, introducing her to Boston's social elite as our brightest young talent. Ruby learned to navigate the subtle hierarchies, to smile through veiled insults from women who saw her as an intruder, to dance at charity galas without betraying her Dorchester roots. "You're a natural at this," Jonathan told her after one such event, as his driver took them back to the office. "Margaret would have loved you." The genuine affection in his voice made Ruby's carefully constructed walls tremble. That night, she met Chris in their usual hotel room, her gala dress traded for the simple clothes she kept in her office. "He's falling for it," she reported, but her voice lacked its usual triumph. Chris was too excited to notice her hesitation. "The foundation meeting is next week. We need to accelerate the timeline." "What do you mean?" "He needs to propose before those papers are signed." Chris pulled her close, his fingers digging into her arms with unusual force. "Whatever it takes, Ruby. Remember what we're fighting for." Ruby remembered their first meetings, the thrill of forbidden romance, the shared dreams of a future free from constraints. But lately, Chris's touch felt possessive rather than passionate, his ambition crowding out the charm that had first drawn her in. The next day, Jonathan invited her to tour his estate's gardens. As they walked among Margaret's roses, Ruby felt his eyes on her, saw the loneliness and hope he no longer tried to hide. "These white ones were her favorite," he said softly. "She always said they represented new beginnings." Ruby touched a perfect bloom, thinking of her own mother's tiny window box of geraniums. The contrast between her two worlds had never felt sharper. "Ruby," Jonathan's voice was hesitant, almost young. "Would you join me for dinner tomorrow? Not at a restaurant. Here, at the house. There's something I'd like to discuss." She looked up at him, this powerful man suddenly uncertain, and felt the web she'd woven begin to constrict around her own heart. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another demanding text from Chris, no doubt, but she ignored it. "I'd love to," she heard herself say, and part of her meant it. Storm clouds gathered over Boston's skyline as Ruby left the estate that evening. The Rothschild mansion loomed behind her like a beautiful trap, its windows glowing with warmth and warning. Tomorrow's dinner would set in motion events that couldn't be undone, leading inexorably toward that fatal December night when all their carefully laid plans would unravel in blood and betrayal. But for now, there was only the soft scent of roses, the weight of expectations, and the growing realization that in weaving this web of deception, Ruby had entangled herself most of all. The private dining room of the Rothschild mansion glowed with candlelight, transforming the austere space into something almost magical. Ruby sat across from Jonathan, her heart racing beneath her carefully composed exterior. The ring box sat between them on the antique mahogany table, black velvet stark against white linen, and Ruby could feel the weight of generations of Rothschild wealth in the flawless diamond gleaming inside. "I know this may seem sudden," Jonathan said, his usual commanding voice softened with uncertainty. "And I know there will be talk. But you've brought something back into my life that I thought was lost forever." His hand trembled slightly as he reached for hers. "Will you marry me, Ruby?" She let tears fill her eyes, real ones, though not for the reasons he imagined. "Yes," she whispered, and sealed her fate. Chris's reaction, hours later in their hotel room, was less romantic. He paced the room like a caged animal, pausing occasionally to stare at the ring now adorning Ruby's finger. "It's my mother's," he said flatly. "He always said that ring would go to my wife someday." "Chris," Ruby reached for him, but he pulled away. "This is what we planned. What we wanted. Seeing him parade you around, touching you." He slammed his fist into the wall, making her jump. "You're mine. Don't forget that." The news of Jonathan Rothschild's engagement to his young receptionist hit Boston's social circle like a perfectly timed bomb. Ruby found herself thrust into a world of engagement parties and wedding plans, each event a minefield of subtle snubs and veiled insults from society women who viewed her as an interloper. "Don't let them bother you," Jonathan advised, his arm protective around her waist at yet another cocktail party. "They're jealous of your youth, your vitality." His possessive grip tightened as younger men passed by, his eyes tracking their gazes. "You've made me feel young again." At home in Dorchester, the reactions were equally complex. Ruby's mother cried when she heard the news, but not from joy. Mija, Maria Martinez pleaded, her English slipping into Spanish as it did when she was upset. "He's older than your father. This isn't right. Mama, please." Ruby held her mother's work-worn hands. "Mr. Rothschild, Jonathan. He can give us everything we've ever dreamed of. No more cleaning houses. No more taxi shifts for Papa." "Some dreams cost too much," Maria replied softly, touching the massive diamond that seemed to weigh down her daughter's delicate hand. The wedding plans quickly spiraled into a society spectacle. Jonathan spared no expense, brushing aside Ruby's protests about cost. "You'll be a Rothschild," he reminded her. "Everything must be perfect." He hired Boston's most exclusive wedding planner, who looked at Ruby's Pinterest board of modest wedding ideas with barely concealed disdain. Chris played his part masterfully, appearing at family dinners and wedding tastings as the supportive son. "I'm happy father has found someone," he would say, raising his glass in elegant toasts. But his eyes followed Ruby's every move, and their secret meetings became more intense, more desperate. The foundation paperwork is still in process, he reminded her during one such rendezvous. We need this marriage legal before he signs everything away. Ruby nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The nausea had started 3 days ago. At first, she'd blamed it on stress, on the rich food at endless engagement parties. But now, alone in her bathroom each morning, she felt a different kind of fear taking root. The pregnancy test confirmed her suspicions 2 weeks before the wedding. Ruby stared at the positive result in her tiny bathroom, the sounds of her mother cooking breakfast filtering through the thin walls. The timing was impossible to hide. She and Jonathan hadn't been intimate, his old-world manners insisting on waiting for their wedding night. The child could only be Chris's. She hid the test in her purse with shaking hands and went to meet the wedding planner, who was busy transforming St. Paul's Cathedral into a fairy tale setting. The church where Ruby's parents had married in a simple ceremony 28 years ago would now host the society wedding of the year. Jonathan's obsession with perfection grew as the wedding approached. He sent Ruby to etiquette coaches, hired stylists to refine her wardrobe, insisted she move into the guest house of the estate to prepare for your new life. His calls and texts came at all hours, asking where she was, who she was with. Ruby felt the walls closing in, but it was too late to back out. The night before the wedding, Ruby stood in her childhood bedroom one last time, packing away the last pieces of her old life. Her mother appeared in the doorway, holding a small box. Your grandmother's mantilla, Maria said, opening it to reveal delicate lace. She wore it on her wedding day in Mexico. I wore it when I married your father. She paused, searching her daughter's face. Ruby, am I a more? Are you sure about this? Ruby touched the lace, thinking of the secret growing inside her, of Chris's increasingly volatile moods, of Jonathan's consuming attention. It's too late for doubts, Mama. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, early autumn sunlight streaming through the cathedral's stained glass. Ruby stood in the bride's room, surrounded by flowers and finery that cost more than her father's taxi. The mantilla, pinned carefully over her designer veil, was the only piece of her old life visible beneath the Rothschild glamour. In the church, Boston's elite filled the pews, their curiosity barely masked by solemnity. Chris stood at the altar beside his father as best man, his handsome face set in an appropriate smile. Jonathan waited for his bride, distinguished in his mourning coat, his silver hair gleaming. The orchestra began the wedding march, and Ruby took her first step toward her new life. The heavy cathedral doors swung open, revealing her in her hand-beaded gown, her father trembling slightly as he prepared to give her away. She caught Chris's eye for a fraction of a second as she passed him, saw the muscle in his jaw clench. Jonathan's face shone with triumph and devotion as she approached. Ruby forced herself to smile back, one hand resting carefully over her still flat stomach. Above them, the autumn light filtered through ancient stained glass, painting them all in jewel tones, the wealthy groom, his scheming son, and the bride carrying a secret that would destroy them all. Later, photographers would remark that despite the perfect weather, every photo from that day showed storm clouds gathering in the distance, as if nature itself was trying to warn them of what was to come. The Rothschild mansion swallowed Ruby whole. Her first weeks as Mrs. Jonathan Rothschild were a blur of new routines, strict expectations, and endless social obligations. The East Wing Master Suite, recently redecorated in preparation for the new bride, felt more like a museum than a bedroom. Every morning, she woke beneath imported silk sheets, surrounded by carefully curated artwork and generations of Rothschild history weighing down on her. Jonathan had specific ideas about how a Rothschild wife should behave. Breakfast was served promptly at 8 in the morning room, where Ruby was expected to look perfectly groomed and ready to discuss the day's social calendar. The household staff, a butler, 2 maids, a cook, and a groundskeeper, watched her every move with barely concealed curiosity. The morning sickness made these carefully orchestrated breakfasts a special kind of torture. Ruby learned to time her bouts of nausea between coffee and toast, excusing herself with practiced grace. Just wedding nerves settling, she told the concerned house staff, but Mrs. Henderson, the eagle-eyed housekeeper, watched her with knowing suspicion. Jonathan's possessiveness grew with each passing day. He insisted on accompanying her to doctor's appointments, which forced Ruby to create an elaborate system of fake checkups to maintain her prenatal care with a discreet clinic across town. Her phone was filled with careful codes: shopping with friends, meant ultrasound appointments, charity committee meeting, translated to rushed encounters with Chris in their downtown hotel room. "You're being careless," Chris hissed during one such meeting, pacing the hotel suite while Ruby lay exhausted on the bed. "Henderson asked me if you were feeling all right yesterday. She's watching you." "I can't help morning sickness," Ruby snapped, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. The pregnancy had made her bold, reckless. "Your father's starting to notice too. We need to tell him something." "Tell him?" Chris laughed bitterly. "That his new wife is carrying his grandchild? That would go over brilliantly." At home, Jonathan's attention became suffocating. He insisted on reviewing her daily schedule, questioning every appointment, every lunch date. The Rothschild name, he reminded her constantly, carried obligations. Her wardrobe was slowly replaced with designer pieces he deemed appropriate. Even her friends were subtly vetted, with invitations mysteriously disappearing when he disapproved of the company. "I ran into Claire Thompson at the club," he mentioned one evening over dinner, his tone carefully casual. "She said you cancelled lunch rather abruptly yesterday." Ruby pushed her untouched food around the plate, fighting another wave of nausea. "I wasn't feeling well. A migraine. That's happening rather frequently lately." Jonathan's fork clinked against fine china. "Perhaps we should see Dr. Harrison about these spells of yours." "No!" Ruby's response came too quickly. She forced her voice to soften. I'm sure it's nothing. Just adjusting to everything." The society ladies of Boston watched Ruby's integration into their world with predatory interest. At charity luncheons and gallery openings, they circled her like elegant sharks, testing for weakness. "My dear," Mrs. Blackwood cornered her at a hospital board meeting, "you're looking rather peaked. Marriage agrees with some better than others, I suppose." The whispers grew louder as Ruby's absences from social events became more frequent. Her mother, during their increasingly rare phone calls, heard the strain in her voice. "Come home for dinner," Maria pleaded. "Let me take care of you like when you were small." But there was no going back to that simple life. Ruby's world had narrowed to a series of careful deceptions: loose dresses to hide her growing bump, strategic shawls and jackets, expertly timed appearances and exits. Chris became increasingly paranoid, convinced every household staff member was reporting back to his father. "We need to accelerate the plan," he insisted during another hotel meeting. "Once the foundation paperwork is signed." "I can barely keep breakfast down," Ruby interrupted. "I can't think about schemes right now." Chris grabbed her arm, harder than necessary. "You're not backing out now. We're too close." The bruises from his grip lasted a week. Ruby covered them with expensive bracelets Jonathan had given her as wedding gifts. At 3 months, the morning sickness should have been easing, but stress made it worse. Ruby found herself rushing from a breakfast meeting with Jonathan's business associates, barely making it to the powder room before being violently ill. When she emerged, pale and shaking, she found Mrs. Henderson waiting with a glass of water and knowing eyes. "When I was carrying my Thomas," the housekeeper said quietly, "ginger tea helped. And crackers. First thing in the morning. Before you even sit up." Ruby froze, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Henderson, The master doesn't need to know everything that happens in his house." The older woman's face was unreadable. "Not yet, anyway." The incident shook Ruby deeply. That night, she lay awake in the massive master bed, listening to Jonathan's steady breathing beside her. The moon cast shadows through the French windows, making the room feel like a beautiful prison. Her phone buzzed softly, another demanding text from Chris, but she couldn't bring herself to read it. The next week brought a parade of social obligations that couldn't be avoided. The annual Rothschild Foundation Gala was the crown jewel of Boston's social season, and as the new Mrs. Rothschild, Ruby was expected to shine. She spent hours with the family tailor, adjusting and readjusting her gown to disguise her changing body. The night of the gala, Ruby descended the mansion's grand staircase in deep blue silk, carefully styled to create illusions. Jonathan waited at the bottom, beaming with pride at his young wife. Chris stood beside him, playing the dutiful son, but his eyes held warning. The ballroom of the Rothschild mansion filled with Boston's elite, all watching the new Mrs. Rothschild for signs of weakness. Ruby floated through the crowd, declining champagne with practiced excuses, keeping her movements careful and measured. But halfway through dinner, the room began to spin. She barely made it to the private bathroom off the library. The sound of her retching echoed against marble, and she prayed the music would cover it. When she finally emerged, she found not only Mrs. Henderson waiting, but also Margaret Blackwood and Claire Thompson, their faces masks of false concern. "My dear," Margaret's voice dripped with satisfaction, "you really must see a doctor about these episodes. Unless, of course, there's a happy announcement coming soon." Ruby steadied herself against the wall, suddenly aware of how this must look, her careful facade cracking, her condition becoming impossible to hide. Behind the society women, she saw Chris watching from the doorway, his face dark with barely contained panic. "I think," she managed, "I need some air." But as she turned to leave, her heel caught on the expensive carpet. She stumbled, her hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach, a gesture too maternal to be mistaken for anything else. The silence in the hallway was deafening. Later that night, after the last guests had gone and the mansion settled into uneasy quiet, Ruby stood at her bedroom window watching storm clouds gather over Boston. Her phone lit up with increasingly frantic texts from Chris, but she couldn't focus on them. In the reflection of the glass, she could see her profile clearly for the first time in weeks. There was no hiding it anymore, the subtle curve of her stomach, the fullness in her face, the unmistakable glow of impending motherhood. Tomorrow, there would be phone calls. Rumors would spread through Boston's social circle like wildfire. The staff would whisper in corners, counting backwards to the wedding date. And Jonathan would begin to question everything. Ruby pressed her forehead against the cool glass, one hand resting on her growing secret. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, and somewhere in the massive house, a clock struck midnight. The honeymoon phase was over. The real nightmare was about to begin. Ruby's hands shook as she handed Jonathan the pregnancy test, watching his weathered face transform with joy. They stood in their master bathroom, morning light streaming through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows that hid her terror. "A baby," he whispered, pulling her close. "A miracle at my age." His happiness was genuine, pure, making the truth burn even more painfully in her throat. She felt his tears dampen her hair as he held her, his body trembling with emotion. The announcement at breakfast the next morning sent the household staff into carefully controlled celebration. Mrs. Henderson's knowing looks had turned almost sympathetic, while the rest of the servants buzzed with excitement about a Rothschild heir. Ruby caught fragments of their whispered conversations, at his age, and must have been the honeymoon, that made her stomach clench with more than morning sickness. Jonathan threw himself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness. The finest doctors were consulted, appointments made, and an entire wing of the mansion designated for a nursery. But as he reviewed the medical paperwork one evening in his study, Ruby saw his expression change. She watched him flip pages back and forth, his financial mind calculating dates and times with mechanical precision. "The doctor says you're 14 weeks along," he said carefully, not looking up from the papers. "But we've only been married 12 weeks. Ruby had prepared for this moment, rehearsed her lines carefully. "Pregnancies are dated from the last cycle," she explained smoothly. "It makes them sound further along than they are. The doctor said this is perfectly normal." Jonathan nodded slowly, but something had shifted in his eyes. That night, Ruby heard him on the phone in his study, speaking in low tones about medical terminology and gestational timing. Chris was livid when she told him about the pregnancy announcement. In their hotel room, now feeling more like a trap than a sanctuary, he paced like a caged animal. "You should have waited," he snarled. "Given us time to figure something out." "Figure what out?" Ruby's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm showing. People are talking. Your father's not stupid. He was going to realize soon enough. There are doctors," Chris said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Discreet ones. Expensive. But..." "No." Ruby wrapped her arms protectively around her middle. I won't. Chris grabbed her shoulders, fingers digging into flesh. Then you've killed us both. Everything we've worked for, gone. Back at the mansion, Ruby began noticing small changes. Jonathan's casual questions about her schedule became more pointed. Her private phone would be slightly moved from where she'd left it. The household staff watched her with new wariness, as if waiting for something to break. She discovered the first proof of his suspicions accidentally. A receipt fell from Jonathan's jacket pocket as she hung it up. A bill from a private investigation firm dated 3 days after the pregnancy announcement. Her hands trembled as she read the preliminary report summary. Surveillance authorized, phone records requested. That night at dinner, Jonathan was unusually quiet, studying her over his wine glass. You missed your charity committee meeting today, he said finally. Ruby's fork froze halfway to her mouth. There had been no meeting. She'd used that excuse to meet Chris. I wasn't feeling well, she said. The morning sickness. Curious, Jonathan interrupted softly. Since Mrs. Blackwood saw you entering the Fairmorn Hotel downtown. His voice remained pleasant, conversational, but his eyes had turned to steel. Not very charitable activities occurring there, I imagine. Ruby felt the blood drain from her face. I needed to lie down. I didn't want to worry you. You've been worried about a lot of things lately, haven't you, my dear? Jonathan stood, his movement deliberately slow. Worried about phone records? About security cameras? About those mysterious appointments that never seem to appear in any doctor's books? He walked to his desk, removing a thick folder. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate? That I wouldn't protect what's mine? He began laying out photographs. Ruby entering the hotel, Chris following minutes later. Phone records showing countless calls and texts. Bank statements revealing a pattern of hotel charges. Everything you've done. Every lie you've told. Every secret meeting. It's all here. Jonathan's voice remained eerily calm. But there was one thing I couldn't understand. Why the elaborate deception? Why not just ask for money, like all the other gold diggers? But then I remembered something interesting. He pulled out another document, a copy of his draft will, the one designating billions to charity. Chris was quite upset about this, wasn't he? Quite vocal about his disapproval. Ruby backed away as Jonathan approached, her hip hitting the edge of his heavy desk. It's not what you think. No. Jonathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not a convenient arrangement between my ambitious son and his beautiful accomplice? Not a plot to secure the fortune before I could give it away. His hand shot out, gripping her arm with surprising strength. But you made one crucial mistake, my dear. One miscalculation that brought down your entire house of cards. His other hand pressed against her stomach, where his supposed heir grew. Numbers don't lie. And neither do DNA tests. Ruby's breath caught. What? Did you really think I wouldn't demand a paternity test? That I wouldn't protect my legacy? Jonathan's grip tightened. The results came in this morning. Would you like to know what they say? Or shall we ask Chris? The study door opened, revealing Chris standing there, his face ashen. Behind him, 2 private investigators waited silently. Come in, son. Jonathan's voice dripped with venom. Let's discuss your contribution to the Rothschild family line. Ruby's hand flew to her throat, feeling the delicate chain of her necklace, a wedding gift from Jonathan, suddenly feeling like a noose. Outside, thunder rolled across Boston's skyline, and she realized with horrifying clarity that she was trapped between 2 ruthless men in a house where no one would hear her scream. The pristine walls of Boston's most exclusive obstetrics clinic seemed to close in around Ruby as she sat in the private waiting room. Jonathan insisted on accompanying her to every appointment now, his weathered hand gripping hers with possessive intensity. The ultrasound technician's face remained professionally neutral as she performed the scan. But Ruby saw her eyes flick between the screen's measurements and Jonathan's increasingly rigid posture. 16 weeks, the technician announced, the words falling like hammer blows in the quiet room. Everything appears healthy and right on schedule. Jonathan's financial mind, the same precision that had built his empire, calculated backwards instantly. Ruby watched the realization dawn in his eyes, followed by something darker. His fingers dug into the leather armrest of his chair, knuckles turning white. "Are you quite certain of the dating?" His voice remained eerily calm. The technician nodded, pointing to measurements on the screen. "The development markers are very clear, Mr. Rothschild. Would you like to hear the heartbeat?" But Jonathan had already stood, turning away from the image of his wife's betrayal flickering on the screen. "Get dressed," he told Ruby. "We're leaving." The drive home was silent, tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Ruby watched Jonathan's hands grip the steering wheel, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, and knew with terrible certainty that she needed to run. Back at the mansion, she waited until Jonathan locked himself in his study before calling Chris. Her hands shook as she threw essentials into a small bag: passport, some cash, her mother's rosary. "He knows," she whispered into the phone. "The ultrasound. Chris," he did the math. "I need help. Please. Are you insane?" Chris's voice crackled with panic. "If we run now, we lose everything. The foundation paperwork isn't finalized. All that work, for nothing." "Work?" Ruby's voice broke. "I'm carrying your child." "A child that ruins everything if you don't stick to the plan," Chris hissed. Just calm down. I'll figure something out." The line went dead. Ruby stared at her phone, suddenly feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. As she moved to put it away, the screen lit up with an incoming text from Chris: "Delete everything. Now." But before she could comply, the phone was snatched from her hand. Jonathan stood in the doorway of their bedroom, his face a mask of cold fury. "Planning a trip, my dude." Ruby backed away as he scrolled through her phone, watching months of evidence unfold in his hands. Countless messages, secret meetings, the entire conspiracy laid bare in digital form. Fascinating reading. Jonathan's voice was dangerously soft. "You and Christopher are quite the creative writers. Once the old man signs the foundation papers, we'll be free. Just keep him happy a little longer. Baby, such devotion to your craft." "Jonathan, please." Ruby reached for her bag, but he moved faster than she'd thought possible for his age. "My study. Now." The walk down the mansion's long hallway felt like a death march. Family portraits watched their passage, generations of Rothschilds bearing witness to the unfolding tragedy. In the study, Chris already waited, his face ashen. "Sit." Jonathan's command cracked like a whip. Ruby sank into one of the leather chairs, her hands instinctively covering her stomach. Chris remained standing, his eyes darting between them like a trapped animal. "I expected this from gold diggers," Jonathan began, pouring himself a drink with deliberate slowness. "I've dealt with them before. But my own son? My own blood." The crystal tumbler shattered in his grip, sending whiskey and blood dripping onto priceless Persian carpets. "It wasn't like that." Ruby's voice was barely a whisper. "I loved him. I still love him." The words hung in the air like poison. Jonathan laughed, a horrible, broken sound. "Love." He advanced on her, bleeding hand raised. "You conspired to steal my fortune, seduced me while sleeping with my son, and now carry the evidence of your betrayal in your womb. That's not love, my dear. That's damnation." "Father," Chris finally spoke, "let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Jonathan whirled on him. "Like you were reasonable when you plotted to steal your inheritance? When you used this whore to cuckold your own father?" Ruby saw something snap behind Jonathan's eyes, the last thread of sanity giving way to primal rage. She bolted for the door, but he moved with terrible swiftness, catching her arm. "No one betrays the Rothschild name," he snarled, fingers closing around her throat. "No one steals what's mine." "Chris!" Ruby gasped, reaching toward him. But Chris backed away, face contorted with conflict and cowardice. She fought with desperate strength, thinking of the life growing inside her. Books crashed from shelves, priceless artifacts shattered on the floor. Ruby's nails raked Jonathan's face, drawing blood, but his grip only tightened. The world began to dim at the edges. She was barely aware of Chris fleeing the room, of her body being slammed against Jonathan's heavy desk. Her last conscious thought was of her mother's warning. Some dreams cost too much. The struggle ended with terrible suddenness. Ruby's body slumped across the desk, dark hair fanned out across scattered papers, marriage certificates, foundation documents, and paternity test results mingling with spreading crimson stains. Jonathan stood over her, blood dripping from his hands, staring at what he'd done with dawning horror. Outside his study windows, Boston's lights twinkled indifferently. Minutes or hours later, time had lost all meaning. Mrs. Henderson's scream shattered the mansion's silence. The housekeeper had come to deliver Jonathan's evening tea, only to find destruction and death in the place she'd served so faithfully. By the time police arrived, storm clouds had gathered over the Rothschild estate. They found Jonathan sitting in his chair, still staring at his hands, muttering about legacy and betrayal. Ruby's body lay where she'd fallen, one hand still protectively curved around her stomach, her mother's rosary tangled in her fingers. On the desk, her phone still displayed her last unsent message to Chris. "I can't do this anymore. The baby deserves better than a life built on lies." Mrs. Henderson, giving her statement to detectives, would later recall something strange. Despite the violence evident in the room, Ruby's face held an expression almost like peace, as if, in her final moments, she'd found freedom from the web of deception that had ultimately claimed her life. Detective Maya Chen had seen her share of crime scenes in 15 years with Boston homicide, but the Rothschild study stopped her cold. The massive room, once a testament to old money refinement, had become a tableau of tragedy. Ruby's body lay across the mahogany desk like a broken doll, one hand still curved protectively over her stomach. Blood had seeped into priceless Persian carpets, stained ancient leather-bound books, turned million-dollar art into macabre witnesses. Jonathan Rothschild sat in his leather chair, unnaturally still, staring at his blood-stained hands. He hadn't moved since Mrs. Henderson's screams brought the household staff running. "She betrayed the legacy," he muttered as uniformed officers led him away. They both did. Chris Rothschild collapsed when they told him. He'd been found at his downtown apartment, reeking of whiskey, a half-packed suitcase open on his bed. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he sobbed, falling to his knees. "I loved her. Oh God, I loved her." But love, Detective Chen would soon discover, was the smallest part of this story. The investigation unfolded like a Russian nesting doll of deception. Each layer revealed new horrors: the planned seduction, the pregnancy trap, the inheritance scheme. Ruby's phone yielded hundreds of messages between her and Chris, documenting their plot in damning detail. Security cameras caught their secret meetings at the Fairmont. Hotel staff remembered them, the handsome heir and his father's beautiful young wife, playing their parts in a tragedy of their own writing. The Martinez family's grief shook the city's conscience. Maria Martinez's wails when she identified her daughter's body haunted the precinct for days. "I told her," she sobbed in Spanish, clutching her husband's arm. "I told her that house would destroy her." Boston's media descended like vultures on carrion. The headlines wrote themselves. Rothschild romance ends in murder. Pregnant bride killed by elderly husband. Inheritance scheme turns deadly. Reporters camped outside the mansion, fighting for every scrap of scandal. The young bride's murder became a symbol of class warfare, of immigrant dreams corrupted by greed, of old money's brutal power. Jonathan's deterioration was swift and absolute. In custody, he alternated between rage and confusion, sometimes convinced Ruby was still alive, other times reciting stock prices to empty air. His lawyers quickly built an insanity defense, documenting his spiral into paranoid obsession. He discovered the affair, they argued in preliminary hearings, and suffered a psychotic break. A tragic crime of passion. But Detective Chen kept pulling threads. The foundation paperwork, the timing of the pregnancy, Chris's mounting debts. It all painted a darker picture. When she finally confronted Chris with the full weight of evidence, he broke. It was supposed to be simple, he confessed, looking decades older than his 35 years. Seduce him, marry him, get control of the fortune before he could give it away. Ruby, she was perfect for it. Beautiful, ambitious, hungry for a better life. "I never thought." His voice cracked. I never thought he'd kill her. I never thought I'd watch him do it and be too much of a coward to stop it. The trial became Boston's finest theater. Old money filled the galleries, watching one of their own fall from grace. The Martinez family sat in silent dignity, their working-class presence a stark reminder of the human cost of wealth's machinations. Evidence mounted day by day. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated seduction and betrayal. The defense argued temporary insanity, diminished capacity, the desperate acts of a man discovering his young wife's infidelity. But it was Mrs. Henderson's testimony that sealed their fate. The housekeeper described watching the tragedy unfold over months, Ruby's growing fear, Jonathan's obsessive control, Chris's cowardly manipulations. She tried to leave that night, Mrs. Henderson testified, her proper British reserve cracking. I heard her packing, saw her with that small bag. If I'd only helped her then. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. Jonathan Rothschild, despite his mental state, was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging his deteriorating condition, sentenced him to life in a secure psychiatric facility. Chris's verdict took longer. Defense lawyers argued he was merely Ruby's lover, not part of the murder. But prosecutors had his confession, the conspiracy evidence, his presence during the killing. You watched your father murder the woman carrying your child, the prosecutor said during closing arguments. You listened to her beg for help, and you walked away. That makes you as guilty as the hands around her throat. The jury agreed. Chris Rothschild received 25 years for conspiracy and criminal negligence resulting in death. In a final twist of fate, the Rothschild fortune ended up exactly where Jonathan had originally intended. With both heir and patriarch imprisoned, the estate defaulted to the foundation's control. Billions of dollars, fought over with such deadly consequence, would now serve the public good. Maria Martinez, showing remarkable grace in her grief, established the Ruby Martinez Memorial Scholarship. For young women with dreams, she explained at the announcement, but who need help finding better ways to achieve them. The scholarship, funded partly by the Rothschild Foundation in a gesture of atonement, would help working-class daughters attend college. Ruby's death, which began as a scandal of the wealthy, became a legacy of hope for the communities she'd come from. 1 year after the murder, Detective Chen visited the Rothschild mansion one last time. The property was being converted into a community center, its priceless art and artifacts donated to museums. In the study, now empty of its blood-soaked carpets and heavy furniture, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. She found Mrs. Henderson supervising the packing of the last items. The housekeeper held a small frame, a photograph from Ruby's wedding day. In it, the young bride smiled at the camera, her face full of hope and ambition, unaware that the men flanking her would orchestrate her doom. The true price of greed, Mrs. Henderson said softly, isn't measured in dollars. She handed Detective Chen a familiar object, Ruby's mother's rosary, finally released from evidence. Perhaps you could return this to Mrs. Martinez? Some things should go home. Later that day, in the Martinez family's modest Dorchester apartment, Chen delivered the rosary to Maria. The grieving mother held the beads to her heart, tears falling silently. On the small table beside her lay a college acceptance letter for a local girl, the first recipient of the Ruby Martinez Memorial Scholarship. Next to it, a newspaper announced the opening of the Rothschild Foundation's first community health clinic. Outside, Boston's skyline stretched toward heaven, its glass towers catching the setting sun. Somewhere in those glittering heights, ambitious young women still dreamed of better lives. But perhaps now, thanks to Ruby's tragic story, they'd find safer paths to follow those dreams. In the end, 3 families were destroyed by greed and betrayal. But from their ashes rose something unexpectedly noble, proof that even the darkest tragedy could spark a light of hope for others to follow.